Good evening, everyone. Please take your seats for the first lecture of the evening. I'm Paul Eno. I am your MC for the event this year. To the Greater New England UFO Conference, 7th year, and next year's will be October 3rd and 4th. 2nd and 3rd. And we will begin with Aleksandar Petakov this evening. Aleksandar was born in South Africa in 1993, during the last year of apartheid. His parents had fled the civil war in the former Yugoslavia. Interested in filmmaking from a young age, Aleksandar filmed home movies for years before pursuing film and media in high school and college, as well as history and political science. His love of film, global events, history, and even cryptozoology have merged to allow him to create unique short films, in particular documentaries. Aleksandar is a 2015 Quinnipiac University graduate with a BA in film, video, and interactive media. He is going to speak this evening on lake monsters of New England. Where are they lurking? And just on a personal note, Aleksandar is a sort of honorary son of mine, part of our paranormal gang with my son Ben. And I must say that I've always been of the opinion that Aleksandar has not only the classiest name in the paranormal, but also the very best beard. Ladies and gentlemen, Aleksandar Petakov.
Oh man, I don't know about the beard thing, but how's everyone doing tonight? Great. So as Paul eloquently put it, I'm going to be talking about lake monsters of New England, but not only lake monsters, we're going to talk about a couple of water monsters as well, as there are some of those guys too. So we'll get started here in a moment. All right, before we kick off, I just want to first dedicate this presentation to a good friend of mine, Michael Mitchell. Some of you, I'm sure, know of him, and he was going to speak at this conference originally. He recently just passed away, really suddenly and tragically, and I just wanted to dedicate it to him because I worked on a comic book with him called Granite State Bigfoot, and it was all about Bigfoot history in New Hampshire, and he was so passionate about these subjects, whether it was Exeter UFOs or the first witch in New Hampshire. He did a lot of amazing comics on various topics, so just keep him in your thoughts and prayers, and his family as well. So just a bit about myself. I'm a documentary filmmaker and kind of cryptozoology researcher, and a couple of projects I've done. What I really first started with was called Mystery at Loch Ness, just a short little documentary about the Loch Ness Monster, which is so famous, and I'll keep referring to Loch Ness all night, as you'll see. Sasquatch Out of the Shadows is basically just an open-ended documentary series, also a YouTube series where I just explore different aspects of the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch mystery. As I'm sure some of the other speakers will talk about tonight, it's quite a lot of subjects within Bigfoot that are pretty interesting to explore. So that's, like I said, open-ended. This is, of course, the Granite State Bigfoot comic book, which looks at very interesting Bigfoot cases from the 1970s in New Hampshire. On the Trail of Champ, which is a series about the Lake Champlain monster, which I'll talk a little bit about later, pertaining to the topic, of course, lake monsters of New England. This is a New England Cryptids map. If some of you might remember from last year, I talked about cryptids of New England, and this is sort of the map that I've put together. I have a couple of those at the table, so you can feel free to come by and check them out afterwards. So what is cryptozoology? Cryptozoology is the study of hidden or unknown animals, and the creatures themselves are called cryptids. So you've got things like Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Yeti, Loch Ness Monster, even mountain lions. That's technically part of the cryptid realm. Some people believe there's supernatural or paranormal connections, so some cryptids might be more on that side, such as Mothman or the Dover Demon. That's much more in the kind of alien or extraterrestrial sort of realm. Cryptid was actually added to the dictionary, so it's official. You can use that word, and it's in Merriam-Webster. So I thought that was pretty cool. Some former cryptids, you've got creatures like the okapi up here, which is sort of a zebra, giraffe hybrid. The mountain gorilla, of course, giant squid. This is an animal talked throughout legends throughout the centuries, the kraken, giant octopus, and we know they exist now. And then the coelacanth, which is kind of a prime example. This was a fish thought to be extinct for millions of years until a live specimen was pulled up off the coast of South Africa in the 1930s. So we now know that there are populations of them. So it's a very fascinating creature and sort of the poster child for cryptozoology in a lot of ways. There's an element of mythology and folklore, creatures like the dragons and werewolves and even the woodwoes, which is sort of a medieval Bigfoot-like creature seen in a lot of art and architecture from that time period in the Middle Ages in Europe especially. And it kind of looks very similar to, some of the Bigfoot stuff people talk about today. What about lake monsters is so fascinating. So everyone, I'm sure, has seen this picture right here, right? I mean, it's a very popular picture, Loch Ness Monster. It's sadly a hoax, but it's one of those iconic images that once you see it, you know about the Loch Ness Monster. There's something very captivating about bodies of water. Think about even the film Jaws, right? I mean, we're all scared about what's underwater. We don't know. It's a mystery. So the fact that there could be undiscovered animals in these bodies of water, whether they be lakes or rivers or the ocean, has always been a tantalizing factor in the human psyche. And that's why I think we have, as you can see in this map, just Lake Monsters of America, various stories. So we'll talk about some of the ones over here. So yeah, these are a couple of pictures from Loch Ness expeditions. I mean, Loch Ness has been pretty much in the headlines since the 1930s up until last week. I mean, it's very, very popular topic. There's been dozens of expeditions to places like Loch Ness. Pop culture, whether it's serious kind of adult horror films, children's movies, novels, classic movie like the Crater Lake Monster. Anyone here seen that movie? Yeah, it's a good one. So they've really captivated us for a long time. Some of you may have read about the recent Loch Ness DNA study where they kind of took samples of the water there and figured out that maybe it could be an eel. I mean, I know a lot of researchers sort of disagree with that theory, but it just goes to show how deeply ingrained the Loch Ness Monster and this phenomena kind of is with popular culture. New England Cryptids, so we've got Champ, the Dover Demon, and Sasquatch. This is a fun little design I had put together, and I have some stickers of this at my table if anyone's interested. But without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to talk about a couple of legends from each of the New England states. Anybody know what body of water this is? Anyone, any guesses? It's Walden Pond, famous body of water in Massachusetts. There are no lake monsters or monster stories in Walden Pond, unfortunately. But starting it off, we'll talk about the frogmen of Silver Lake. This was kind of a weird story that kind of originated in the 1940s and 50s, where people in Plymouth County's Silver Lake talked about these giant frogs being seen, or little frogmen. A lot of people are kind of scared to talk about it, so it was mostly mentioned in passing in some of the local stores in the area and a little bit of newspaper clippings. There isn't a whole lot of information about it, but this is actually the depiction of an encounter in Ohio called the Loveland Frog. This was a creature seen by police officers, so this is the closest thing to the frogmen of Silver Lake. Now we're going to go over to the ocean. So we're talking the Gloucester sea serpent, part of the Great New England Sea Serpent sightings. And this is an interesting one. These were seen by hundreds of people off Cape Ann in Gloucester, and they were described as being 100 feet long. And this is actually a drawing from that time period. So you could see even at that time, people were very fascinated in these mysteries that were right off the coast, right off the shore. Here's another one, and you can really see that snake-like head with the tongue sticking out. And the mystery got even more intense when a snake was found off the shore of Boston, a deceased kind of little snake-like creature. They thought it was young of the serpent, but it actually turned out to be a snake that just had some sort of diseased bumps on it. But that furthered the mystery, which was obviously very tantalizing at the time. The Nahant sea serpent, also part of that series of sightings. Egg rock and the sea serpent, you can see the many, many humps that are kind of described in the eyewitness accounts. This is a funny one, the Ipswich sea serpent hoax. Now this was a hoax, so it's a fake picture of a sea monster eating what looks to be a child or some sort of person. At the time, people bought it though. You have to remember, In 1910, there wasn't TV, there wasn't the internet, so people weren't bombarded with this fake sort of Photoshop stuff all the time. So I'm not to say people were more gullible, but people believed this sort of stuff more readily. Think of the War of the Worlds when that came out, even later than that, how much hysteria that caused. So that's a fun one I like to highlight. And ending on Massachusetts, we got the Scituate sea monster. Now this is a fun one. You can see shades of Loch Ness comes to Scituate. So Loch Ness on the brain, always people are thinking of Loch Ness. And they're comparing their local monsters and phenomena to Loch Ness. So it actually turned out to be a basking shark that was just severely decomposed, and all you could see was this dragon-like head, some flippers, so it kind of looked like what Nessie's reported to look like. Pretty interesting case, kind of came to that conclusion, though, that it was just a basking shark. Now we're going to go over to New Hampshire. This is Lake Winnipesaukee, one of the more famous bodies of water in New Hampshire. There aren't very many lake monster stories from there, unfortunately, for such a large body of water. So we'll go over to Dublin Lake. Now this little lake, I mean it's a small lake, sits right in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. And this is a bit of a funny story, but it's an unsubstantiated story from the 1980s about a diver exploring caves deep in the lake. He disappeared only to be found days later, wandering around the woods naked, rambling about hideous monsters he had seen in the water. Maybe he was seeing eels or something along those lines, but there really weren't any sightings after that. And Dublin Lake is a popular scuba diving destination. I've driven by there and seen flags and scuba divers coming out, and there's a picture of that right there. So could there be something down there? That's really, we'll have to keep an eye out and listen to what the divers have to say. This was a sunrise I managed to capture there just this past spring. Beautiful, beautiful area, beautiful location. We've got the Glen Lake Monster, a.k.a. Glenny of Goffstown, New Hampshire. Full disclosure, this one's totally fake, totally made up. They made this up like last year to promote a race, the Glen Lake Swim. It's like a charity event. But the reason I included it is to highlight again, lake monster on the brain. I mean, people are creating this story to help bring awareness to an event. This is taken directly from their website, so you got the little graphic there, and then they even went to this link to make a comparison of, the size of Glenny. So there you have it. So now we're going on to Maine. That's Mount Katahdin, obviously the very famous mountain in Maine, and the body of water close to it. Start with the Lake Pockamoonshine Monster. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I mean, how else would you say that? So this is an interesting one. This is a creature described as resembling a water snake. A legend goes that the monster itself was a result of a disagreement between an Algonquin shaman and a chief of a Micmac tribe in the area. Well, the chief turned himself into this enormous serpent, which the shaman was able to vanquish by tying to a tree at one end of the lake. Well, he managed to free himself eventually, and since then, the snake monster has been in the lake, so the legend goes. And there really haven't been too many sightings of this creature, but in 1882, a letter was published in a local newspaper talking about what they called the chain lake snake. And it spoke of two sightings by locals. One was described as its smallest part was as large as a pork barrel. Another, locals have seen the trail of a huge creature, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and a quarter-mile long. Kind of an odd description, but logs had been turned over in its wake, and he had torn things up awfully. So it's a bit of a fanciful story, but maybe that's what the chain lake snake Pockamoonshine monster looks like. We don't know. The Casco Bay Sea Serpent, again onto the sea serpent topic. So Maine, another one of these states that has a lot of coastline, has this Cassie, which is today. So the creature was allegedly killed, and of course the body sunk to the bottom of the lake and they couldn't get it. You know how these kind of stories typically go. Lots of stories from the Whitehall Times. The monster's still at large. It destroys 3 dogs, statements of the parties hunting it. So that was the first serpent scare. And at the time, people knew about the New England sea serpent sightings, which had happened years before. So it was in the consciousness, and people were very interested in these stories. And a lot of the times, the newspapers kind of played up some of the details to sell more newspapers. I mean, it was not uncommon to do that sort of thing. Yellow journalism, that was not really, great journalism at the time, but that's just kind of how it went. And then in the 1920s, Champ came back right before Nessie really stole all the headlines for the next century. story revived of old sea serpent. This was a wood cutting done at that time of what they thought Champ looked like based on some of the eyewitness sightings. So it kind of changes a little bit, but we'll get into actually eyewitness sketches. Now these are interesting because these are all recent sketches. These were basically from the 70s on of what people described they have seen. And I've spoken to dozens of witnesses at this point, especially after doing my documentary series on it. It really kind of convinced me that there's something going on. I was a little bit more skeptical at first, but I'm like, man, these people, the sightings are remarkably consistent in the details and the head and the neck and this sort of stuff. And these are all examples of kind of what people describe seeing. You can see there's a lot of consistency in a lot of the reports. Some of the theories, like with many lake monsters, is it's some sort of prehistoric plesiosaur or ancient reptile, marine reptile. I don't put a lot of weight into that. I mean, just because the likelihood of that is pretty far-fetched. This is my personal favorite theory. I'm not endorsing it entirely, but a giant turtle. So turtles can actually extend their neck, so maybe there's some sort of unknown turtle. And I know at least one person who claims to have seen Champ that said, oh yeah, it had a shell, it was definitely a giant turtle. So that's a fun one. Another one, sturgeon. So sturgeon are these massive ancient fish that have bony plates and spines, and they look very prehistoric if you see one, and they can get to extraordinary lengths. This is one that was pulled up in Lake Champlain in the late 1800s, and you can just see if this was to pull up next to your 5-foot dinghy, that would be a monster by definition of the word, easily dwarfing your boat. A couple other examples. This is one of the last legally caught sturgeon in the lake before they were endangered, and now you can get fined almost $1,000 if you catch or harass sturgeon in Lake Champlain. This was sent to me a couple months ago by a game warden from Vermont, where they had discovered on one of the islands there this absolutely massive sturgeon. It was about 7 feet long. I mean, they had to get 3 guys to pull this thing out. It was so big. One of the last theories is that it's just people mistaking explainable phenomena such as boat wakes, waves, even logs. I mean, remember the Penobscot River monster I talked about. Certainly a portion of that can happen, but that doesn't necessarily explain away all the head and neck sightings, the on-land sightings, some of the more interesting accounts that really defy explanation easily. We're going to talk about the 3 kind of best photographic pieces of evidence of Champ, and this is held up as kind of the best example of any lake monster anywhere. The Mansi Photo, St. Albans, Vermont, 1977. As you can see, many of you probably have seen this photo before. It hasn't been proven to be fake, unlike the Loch Ness one, which is fake. And I was actually the last person to interview Sandra Mansi while she was still alive. And based on my conversations with her, I'm convinced that her family was not involved in perpetuating this as a hoax. They truly saw something that day. If a hoax was pulled on them, that's another story. But the story goes that they were just on a beautiful day on the lake. Her husband and 2 children were frolicking kind of in the water, and then all of a sudden this creature came out of the water and started looking around, and the husband panicked, got the kids out. She managed to snap a picture, and they kind of sat on it for a while, and it wasn't posted until 1981 when it was published in the New York Times front page of Champ. It kind of reinvigorated the Champ mystery. A lot more people started coming out with their sightings after that. Now the photo is not fake in the sense that because it wasn't digital at the time, everything was film, and it was examined by a film lab, and they were able to say, well, this image has not been doctored in the sense that it hasn't been edited or touched up like you would take a picture today and edit it in Photoshop. I mean, so whatever was there was truly there in the water. I mean, if it's a real object or not, that's where the question comes about. But unfortunately, there hasn't been much headway with that. It's just another one of these timeless sort of pieces that's interesting, and perhaps it's a piece of evidence of something unknown in the lake, but until further analysis can be done, it's really unknown. This is just the original there in Burlington, just a quick picture of that. We have the Baudette video in 2005. Now this was taken by 2 fishermen who claimed to see this strange creature, and this is a bit of a crazy one. So basically the footage now is being held hostage by a maniacal entertainment lawyer in New Jersey, and he's had it since 2005. I don't know how this guy came into possession of it, but the story goes that these 2 fishermen had seen this object, and I guess this lawyer was working with them, divorce settlement, and somehow gained access to this footage. So people have offered up to 10 grand for this footage, and they've been laughed out of the office. I know people who have seen it. They try to get you to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so nothing can sadly be done with it. But in the video, there is what looks to be, a creature kind of swimming around. So it's an interesting piece of evidence. And this is just a project. A friend of mine is trying to get the film released. He's trying to like pool money together and see if we can get over 10 grand, and everyone puts in $1 and get this released. So you can find out one way or another if it's real or not. I mean, that's kind of the golden question of what we can do with it. How can we further analyze it? Because it's just being held hostage apparently at this point. Another one is the Olson video taken in 2009 in Oak Ledge Park in Burlington of a strange object. And this was shown to wildlife biologists because they thought, oh, maybe this is a deer or a dog or even a moose just swimming through the water. And they all said, no, it didn't look like any of that because the creature fully submerges itself at one point. So it's kind of interesting that piece of footage was there. I mean, the jogger, he was kind of just hiking, he was jogging in that area, and he happened to see this object kind of pop out of the water. And it sent him kind of scrambling, getting his phone, and this is 2009, so no iPhones. It was like a cheap flip phone, so the quality isn't great. But in this picture, you can see I was there a couple weeks ago, and you can see the Burlington skyline here, and this is the object, and these are these kind of oil rigs here left over, and this creature's there. So kind of the best visual evidence. And then there's the presence of echolocation, supposedly, and I won't get too much into that, but echolocation is considered to be biosonar. It's what whales and aquatic marine animals use to kind of communicate and to hunt as well. And supposedly in Lake Champlain, there has been evidence of this that's been captured. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon because if there's something echolocating in a freshwater lake, what could that be? Lake Champlain was part of the ocean as recently as 10 to 12,000 years ago when it was part of what was called the Champlain Sea. And this was an interesting period because there were whales in this body of water. Vermont's state fossil is actually a beluga whale that was discovered in the 1800s, literally right off the shore of Lake Champlain. So a lot of the people theorize, well, if fish like the sturgeon and the gar and other fish could adapt from salt water into fresh water, perhaps something else could. And that's maybe another piece of the Champ kind of puzzle. And just really quickly, these are a couple photos from my actual production of On the Trail Champ, just interviews with some of the experts there who have really dedicated a lot of time and money and energy into investigating this mystery. Interviews with some eyewitnesses. This guy saw something in the late 1950s with 6 other people, and they were basically fishing and saw a head and a neck come out of the water, and it really scared them, and they weren't sure what it was, and they were actually scared to tell people about it for almost 2 decades because they didn't want to be considered crazy. And this guy, he was a veteran, owned a local business. I mean, telling a story like that, I feel he would almost just have something to lose telling a story like that. You lose credibility. Oh, people say you're high or drunk or whatever. So it's very interesting. This man had seen something literally 3 days before I interviewed him, something huge in the water, and he had been a lifelong fisherman in that area, and it kind of threw him off. This guy owns a boathouse in that area and had multiple sightings, and his sister and mother had seen a large animal and a small animal that looked like these dinosaur-like creatures coming out of the water and going back in a boat ramp. And other people at that area had seen, at the mouth of the river there, the Winooski River, had seen these creatures as well. So kind of an interesting phenomenon. This is myself there trying to get my foot bit off so I can maybe get some DNA on there or something like that. Famous Champ sighting sign there on the New York side in Port Henry, a town which considers itself to be the home of Champ. Natural beauty, like I said, with those people that have been to Lake Champlain, it's just amazing. I mean, whether it's at dusk or any other time of the night, time of the day, it's an incredible area. This is me kayaking there on the widest part of the lake. Flew my drone and I managed to capture this. No, just kidding. I wish. That would have been great, but no. So that was a fun time exploring that series. And just a quick plug for the International Cryptozoology Museum. If you want to learn more about cryptozoology or these topics, check it out in Portland, Maine. Lauren Coleman runs it. You've probably seen him on various TV programs. Well-renowned guy. Lots of stuff about Champ and lake monsters, sea monsters, Loch Ness, Bigfoot, all kinds of stuff. It's fun. If you're in the area, check it out. And just a quick update on stuff I'm doing. I've got other projects coming up. This one's a little bit more related to the conference this weekend, but On the Trail of UFOs. This is a series which is a continuation of that On the Trail of format of my Champ series. And the crew from Ohio, Small Town Monsters, will be coming up in a couple weeks now, and we're actually going to be interviewing some people involved here about the Exeter incident, as well as going up to the White Mountains and talking about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. It's a famous story and one of the first abduction cases, so keep your eyes peeled for that because it's going to be a phenomenal series. And then Lions of the East. This is my project which I announced last year about mountain lions and mystery big cats seen in this area. So it's a very fascinating kind of journey into why some of the states are kind of almost denying this sort of stuff. And yeah, check it out. It'll be out probably by the end of the year. With that said, thank you guys very much. If you have, oh yeah, by the way, petakovmedia.com if you want to check anything else out. Should I do questions or? 4 minutes, okay. Any questions, anything like that, about any of the topics or anything? Yes, sir.
You mentioned before how here at Champlain, how people also have Bigfoot sightings. Do you think that's a cultural thing or except one possible cryptid, or do you think there's some other?
Yeah, so the question was, people see Bigfoot around Lake Champlain as well as Champ, and is that more of a factor that they'll accept both the stories? I think so. I mean, to an extent, a lot of the local businesses certainly do. I mean, like I said, you've got Champ Restaurant and Bigfoot Saloon and statues, and it's fun. I mean, Whitehall just had its Bigfoot Festival last weekend, so I think culturally, it's very popular. And like I said, overall, with the things like Loch Ness being so prominent and known, yeah, I think people really do accept it. But if you're open-minded to this sort of stuff, perhaps other encounters, you might accept more readily. One of the Champ investigators, he had actually seen a Bigfoot, William Dranginis. He had seen a Bigfoot in the 90s, and based off of that, he got involved in the Champ stuff because he talked to Champ witnesses and was like, they're having a very similar experience to mine, So, yeah. Anyone else? Up there? I hope I can hear you. The Wendigo. Oh, okay. That's so yeah, the Wendigo is kind of sort of a supernatural myth, also sometimes called a cryptid, maybe like a Bigfoot-like creature, but there's actually called Wendigo psychosis, and it's like a craving for human flesh, and it's in Native American folklore, especially in Canada and really cold northern places. They talk about, these guys going crazy out in the middle of the wilderness in the dead of winter and starting to eat other people. And to the Native Americans, that was the manifestation of that. You became the Wendigo. You start eating human flesh. You become this demon-like creature, this emaciated, disgusting-looking zombie-like creature. Some people believe it's a cryptid, some more on the paranormal side. So yeah, that's an interesting one, definitely. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes? Okay, I guess I'll have to add that one to the list. Yeah, feel free to stop by the table afterwards. If anyone has anything they want to talk about or anything they want to share, feel free to stop by my table. So, yeah, anyone else? All set? Okay. Thank you, guys.